Welcome back. Now that the search functionality is fully implemented, let's start working on the model for a single recipe selected from the search results. And so let's start by creating a new file in our models folder, of course. So recipe.js. And this one will actually be a bit similar to the search model. Okay, so let's open up this one here side by side. I can close these files. For now, I don't longer need them. So again, we're going to use access here for our Ajax call, and we will also create a class for this recipe to hold all the data for one recipe object. Okay, so import Axios from Axios, and we will export a default class called recipe. We give ourselves a constructor, and this time what we're going to pass in will be the ID. Okay, and then we say this.id equals the ID that we pass in. Okay, so each recipe is identified by an ID, and when we create a new recipe object, what we will pass in is that exact ID. And based on that ID, we can then later do the Ajax call in order to get the rest of the data for the recipe. Okay, and so that's actually the next method that we're going to code, which will be called getRecipe. Okay, and we already know that we're going to use an async here. And so for now, you're super familiar with this stuff already. Okay, let's then use a try catch, such as before. And here just console.log the error in case there is any. But what really matters is, of course, what happens here in the try block. So let's set the result to what we await from the Ajax call using Axios again. Okay, so that's again very similar to what we had here. Now we need again our key and our proxy. And so we could now go ahead and copy these here to the recipe model, but that's not ideal, because then imagine that we had a new key or a new proxy, then we would have to change it in two places, and that's not ideal. So instead of doing that, let's create a configuration file where we can store these two variables, then import this file into these two files, so into these two models, so that we can then use these variables in there. Okay, so we're going to do that right in the home, in the home JavaScript folder, so in here. And I'm simply going to call it config.js. And so I'm going to take these out of here and put them right here. Okay, now it's not actually the best practice to have this kind of data here stored on the client side. Okay, because everyone using your app can easily access, for example, your key. Now in this case, it's not really a big deal, but please remember to never store any real sensitive data like this, so on the JavaScript client side, okay? And ideally, you would do maybe these Ajax calls on your own server and then have your own API from that server, from where you would then do the Ajax call in the front-end client, okay? But for now, in this example, this is perfectly acceptable, okay? So let's then go ahead and import it here, first into the search, and we're going to do a name export, so key and proxy, from another path to the module, which is one folder above, so ... and then config. Okay, and so with that, our proxy and key variables are back here in this file. Just copy them to this other file, to the recipe, and so now we're good to go. Okay, now let's actually go ahead and copy what we have here, and then do some changes, because the URL is really the same, okay, at least up until this point. So let's take out this part, and in order to figure out how we get the recipe, let's then go back to the documentation. Okay, so we have the search and we have the get recipe, remember, and the search request should be to API/search, the one that we used before, and in order to get the recipe we use API/get. Okay, and then the parameter is again the key, and then also the recipe ID, which is here called our ID. So we use the get route, and then we pass the key into, and also the recipe ID. And that recipe ID will be the one stored in our object. So this.id, right? And that's it. So again, this axis call here will then return a promise, which we await because we're in an async function. And so again, we're using async await, which I believe is the best way of using asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, and now just to test this out actually, so in order to see what kind of data we get back from the server, let's just log the result to the console so that we can then figure out what exactly from the response we need to save. Okay, so this should work for now. Let's now go ahead into our main controller, import this recipe model, and then create a new recipe from it. So import recipe from same folder, models, and that's it. Let's add some small comments here. So this was the search controller. And then let's also have the recipe controller. Okay, so we're not going to do the recipe controller just yet, but we already then have our code ready for that. So let's simply create a new variable here for now, just to have a new recipe. And let's pass in an ID. Now, what ID do we actually want to pass in here? Well, let's try out one of the ones that we already have. So let's try to get one from our search result. So we use pizza again, and something did not work here. So we get this error here, and here we see that we have the proxy and the key both set to undefined. So there was probably something wrong with the config file. And yeah, indeed. So here we have to add to export. So in order to actually export these variables from the file. And now that should be working. So let's reload it. And now we should get back the results very soon. And here we are. Now, if we click on one of these, then we will actually have the ID here displayed in the URL bar, right? Because remember that back in the view, let's take a look at that. So in the search view, where we displayed the search result, so where is that? Yeah, so we put the recipe ID here in the href, so this hash symbol and then the recipe ID. Okay, and so that ID is exactly what we need to search for recipes. Okay, and so let's go ahead and copy this number here and then plug it in here into this new recipe. Okay, and so all we need to do now is to call the getRecipe method on this newly created object, right? Because of course this object here inherits this getRecipe method from its prototype. Okay, so that's basically how the ES6 class works behind the scenes with prototypal inheritance. So r.getRecipe, and that should then trigger this console.log here right after we receive back the data from the recipe with the ID that we passed in here as this number. So let's give it a try. It should now reload. It actually already did it here down here. So you already have the data here, and if you open up the data property, then we have our recipe in here. Okay, so we have data.recipe, and then in there we have all kinds of stuff. So we have the image URL, then we have an array of ingredients here. Okay, then we have the publisher, the URL of the publisher, the recipe ID again, and the source and the title. So the source is where the recipe actually comes from and where the directions are. And so we're actually going to need most of these properties that we have in here. Okay, so we need the title, we need the publisher, so the author basically, we need the image, we need the URL itself, and we also need the ingredients. Okay, and all of this data here live at data.recipe. Okay, so let's now go ahead and save all of these to our object. So we want to have the title, so this .title will be, remember, res.data.recipe.title. Okay, so res is the actual result, and then remember that we saw in the console that we have data.recipe where all of this data lives that we need now. Okay, so this.author, I'm going to call it author and not publisher, is at res.data.recipe.publisher. Next up, we want the image. And let's actually just duplicate this here a couple of times. So the URL, which is called the source URL here in the data. And then finally, we want the ingredients. And so that should be working now. So let's get rid of this console.log here. And what I'm going to do instead here is to log our object. So again, this is just for testing, of course. But now I want to actually see the entire recipe. And so here it goes. And indeed, we have our author, the ID, the image, which for some reason is not really working. Then we have the ingredients, we have the title and the URL. So that's all that we need in order to display the recipe on the UI here in one of the next steps. Okay, now something wrong here with the IMG. So probably there was some typo there. And in here, I guess it's just image. Okay, so let's wait for it again. And here you go. So now it's actually there. All right, so that's the data that comes back from the server. Now let's just add a couple more things to our data model. So let me show you how our app works in the end. So what we have here is not only the stuff that we got from the server, but we also have the cooking time and we have the amount of servings. Okay, so let's now add some methods to calculate these. Okay, so let's do calc time. Now, of course, we don't have an accurate way to estimate the time it takes to cook one of these recipes. So let's just do a very, very rough estimate and assume that for every 3 ingredients, we need 15 minutes. Okay, so let's start by saying that the number of ingredients is this dot ingredients dot length, because remember these ingredients here, it will be an array of all the ingredients. Okay, and so with length we get how many ingredients are in there. Then let's calculate how many 15 minutes periods we have. So periods, so we have the number of ingredients divided by 3, and we want to round it up to the highest integer. So math.ceil, and we already reused this one before, right? And so finally we can calculate the time, which is just a period times 15. Okay, let's add that comment here in order to make sense of this code. Okay, so something very simple here. And now for the servings, we're actually not going to do any calculations at all. We're just going to say that this.servings is 4. Okay, so again, we could have like a very complex algorithm here trying to figure out how many servings we are based on the amount of ingredients, but that's not necessary at all. We just say that we have 4 servings on each of the recipes. And okay, that's it for our data model. We're going to add some more stuff to it later, but for now this is enough to get us started with the recipes. Now to finish, let's just test out our error handling here as well. And let's add like an alert here so that the user can actually see the error. And let's actually just say something went wrong. And a sad face. Okay, and so let's assume that we put in the wrong key. So let's just add a couple of random numbers here. And so this, of course, will be a wrong key, and we should then have an error message. Okay, so let's try it out. And indeed, we get this error here, which says we have no access to this resource, which of course is because we have a wrong key. And then the user also gets this message here, something went wrong. Okay, so this also works. So the try catch here again is working. And so let's now start working on the controller of this recipe part right in the next video.